In 1789, starving Parisians stormed the Bastille and ignited a revolution. In 1862, the Confederate Army began losing a war it might otherwise have survived. In 1967, one of the most powerful industries in the world paid scientists to lie to you, and it worked for 30 years. These events happened on different continents, in different centuries, for what looked like completely different reasons. Every single one of them was shaped, at least in part, by sugar. Not bad for something you casually stir into your morning coffee without a second thought. The jungle grass. That started everything. 10,000 years ago, on the island of New Guinea, deep in the tropical lowlands of the South Pacific, a group of people pulled a tall, thick grass out of the wet soil, bit into its fibrous stalk, and tasted something that no human being had ever experienced in quite that form before. Pure, concentrated sweetness. Not the mild sweetness of a piece of fruit. Not the subtle sweetness of honey that you had to raid a beehive to get. Something almost shockingly intense, coming directly out of a plant that looked, from the outside, like it belonged in a riverbank and not in your mouth. That plant was sugarcane. And for thousands of years, that was the full extent of sugar's reach. People in New Guinea and across the Pacific Islands chewed on raw sugarcane stalks for the burst of energy and the simple pleasure of it. There was no processing, no refining, no trade network. Just human beings discovering something wonderful and doing the most logical thing possible, which was to immediately put more of it in their mouths. It spread slowly. Island by island, generation by generation, carried along early migration routes and primitive trading relationships across Southeast Asia. By around 3,500 BC, sugarcane had reached the Indian subcontinent. And that is where everything changed. Because Indian farmers did not just chew the cane. They looked at it and thought, there has to be a better way to do this. They crushed the stalks, boiled the juice down over fire, and watched as the liquid slowly crystallized into a rough, grainy, dark brown solid. They called it kanda. That word, if it sounds vaguely familiar to you, is where the English word candy comes from. Which means that every time a child has ever begged for candy, they were unknowingly invoking a Sanskrit agricultural term from 3,500 years ago. Language is a wild thing. For the first time in human history, sugar was a product. It could be stored. It could be transported. It was no longer tied to a specific plant in a specific place. India had essentially figured out how to bottle sweetness, and the ancient world was never quite the same after that. Indian physicians began prescribing it almost immediately for headaches, stomach ailments, and fatigue. The ancient Sanskrit medical texts describe sugar in terms that sound less like a food and more like a miracle compound. It was sacred. It was medical. It was precious. And it was about to start traveling. Medicine, monarchs, and the Islamic Golden Age. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great pushed his armies east into the Indian subcontinent. His soldiers came back with a lot of stories. One of them involved a plant that produced, in the words of one of Alexander's officers, a reed that produces honey without bees. The Greeks were genuinely baffled. They understood honey. They had been keeping bees for centuries. But the idea that concentrated sweetness could simply grow out of the ground, in a grass, with no bees involved, seemed almost philosophically wrong. And yet, there it was. Here's the thing, though. Even after this discovery, sugar barely moved in the Western world for centuries. It showed up in Roman pharmacies, eventually, sold in tiny quantities at prices that only the genuinely wealthy could afford. Roman doctors prescribed it for stomach problems, for eye infections, for what ancient medical texts described with wonderful vagueness as disorders of the chest. A single pound of sugar could cost a common laborer the equivalent of a full month's wages. Sugar was not food. It was medicine. And it stayed that way in Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The people who actually figured out what sugar could become were Arab traders and scholars during the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 7th through the 13th centuries. Arab chemists built on Indian techniques and improved them dramatically. They developed new methods for purifying and whitening the crystals. They built sugar mills across Persia, Egypt, and North Africa. They planted cane wherever the climate cooperated and engineered a trade network that moved refined sugar across the known world alongside silk, spices, and precious metals. By the time European crusaders arrived in the Levant in 1096, sugar was already woven into the fabric of Middle Eastern cuisine and medicine. The crusaders tasted it and, to put it mildly, lost their composure entirely. They called it a most precious product. Knights loaded bags of it onto their horses alongside their swords and holy relics and hauled it back to Europe, which is a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about medieval priorities. Venice saw the business opportunity before anyone else did. Sitting at the crossroads of East and West, the Venetians imported raw sugar from the Middle East, refined it in their own facilities, and sold it across Europe at staggering markups. For roughly 200 years, Venice held a near monopoly on European sugar. The profits were obscene, and the Venetians spent those profits building a city so beautiful that people still travel from the other side of the planet to look at it. In medieval Europe, sugar was treated the way we treat gold today. Kings displayed enormous sugar sculptures at royal banquets as deliberate demonstrations of wealth. English monarchs kept detailed sugar inventories the way modern governments track foreign currency reserves. At the wedding feast of Henry III in 1236, the royal household purchased over 300 pounds of sugar for a single celebration. That was more than a knight's annual income. For one party. One. Apothecaries locked sugar behind their counters alongside opium and rare spices. If you could afford sugar, you were somebody. If you could not afford it, you almost certainly never tasted it. But here was the problem that was quietly building underneath all of this wealth and exclusivity. Sugarcane only grows in tropical or subtropical climates. You cannot grow it in England. You cannot grow it in France. You absolutely cannot grow it in Scandinavia, and believe me, the Scandinavians have enough to deal with already. European demand was rising fast, but the entire supply chain ran through the Islamic world and through Venice, making it expensive, unreliable, and politically complicated. Something had to give. Columbus, colonialism, and the Caribbean hell machine. In the 1400s, Portugal began colonizing a series of Atlantic islands: Madeira, the Canary Islands, São Tomé, perched off the west coast of Africa. They discovered that these islands had something extraordinary in common with the tropical regions where sugar had always grown. The climate was perfect, the soil was right, and the sunlight was relentless. Portuguese planters set up the first European-controlled sugar plantations on these islands, and they immediately ran into the same problem that would define the next 4 centuries of sugar production. The work was brutal beyond easy description. Planting, harvesting, and processing sugarcane requires backbreaking physical labor in extreme heat, often 18 to 20 hours a day during harvest season. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, injury, and disease at a rate that made the whole enterprise unsustainable if you were using workers who had any choice in the matter. So Portugal turned to enslaved Africans. The sugar plantations of São Tomé became the testing ground for what would become the most horrific forced labor system in modern history. And then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. On his second voyage, he brought sugarcane cuttings with him. The Caribbean climate was perfect. The soil was perfect. The demand back in Europe was insatiable and growing. What followed was not so much an agricultural expansion as an industrial detonation. The process of making sugar was its own kind of horror. After workers cut the cane by hand with machetes in tropical heat, they had to feed the stalks into massive grinding mills within hours because the juice began to spoil almost immediately after cutting. The mills ran around the clock during harvest season, powered by oxen or water or wind, and the workers feeding the cane into the rollers risked losing fingers, hands, and entire arms if their grip slipped. Plantation owners kept hatchets nearby, not as tools, but so that a trapped limb could be severed quickly before the rollers pulled the whole body through. After grinding, the juice was boiled in a series of copper kettles over open fires, each kettle hotter than the last. The boiling house reached temperatures above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing molten sugar were not accidents. They were just part of the day. The work never stopped. There was no pause for darkness or weather, or the simple fact that human beings require sleep to remain human beings. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all scrambled to plant their flags in the Caribbean and South America and get their share of this staggering new industry. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil became sugar factories on a scale the world had never seen. By the 1650s, tiny Barbados, an island roughly the size of San Antonio, Texas, was producing more sugar than all of Brazil. It was the most valuable colony in the entire British Empire. More valuable than all the North American colonies put together. Let that sit for a second. The place that eventually became the United States was, to the British, essentially a consolation prize compared to a Caribbean island the size of a medium American city. History is humbling. Slavery was the business model between the 1500s and the 1800s. Roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic in conditions that defy adequate description. A massive portion of them ended up on sugar plantations. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was 7 years after arrival. 7 years. That is not a statistic that comes from poor record-keeping or uncertain historical data. That number was known. It was calculated. Plantation owners did the math and concluded that it was cheaper to work people to death and purchase replacements than it was to provide living conditions that might allow workers to survive longer. This is the part of sugar's history that gets glossed over fastest, and it is the part that matters most. Sugar did not simply benefit from slavery the way a business might benefit from cheap labor. Sugar engineered slavery. The entire economic logic of the transatlantic slave trade was built around the labor demands of sugar production. Tobacco, cotton, and coffee also used enslaved labor, but sugar was the engine. Sugar was the reason the whole catastrophic system existed at the scale it did. The profits flowed back to Europe and built things that still stand. Mansions in the English countryside, banks in London and Bristol, universities, insurance companies. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar plantations was laundered through centuries of respectable commerce until it became simply the background architecture of the Western world. And most people walking through it today have no idea what it was built on. The triangle trade moved manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean, and sugar from the Caribbean back to Europe. Every corner of that triangle was soaked in the same thing, and the commodity that made the whole machine profitable was sweet enough to stir into your afternoon tea. The revolution that doubled a country. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the island we now call Haiti, enslaved workers on sugar plantations launched the only successful large-scale slave revolt in the recorded history of the world. In 1791, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people rose up simultaneously. They burned the plantations. They fought French, Spanish, and British armies for 12 years. And in 1804, they won their independence. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere, born out of the ashes of sugar fields that had consumed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The shockwave that went through European capitals was not subtle. France lost its most profitable colony overnight. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been nurturing a vision of a French sugar empire that would dominate the Americas, suddenly found himself holding a map that no longer meant what he thought it meant. And this is where sugar accidentally reshapes the geography of an entire continent. Napoleon needed money. He needed to refocus his military ambitions. Without Haiti's sugar revenue, holding the vast Louisiana territory made no financial sense. So in 1803, Napoleon sold it. The whole thing. Over 800,000 square miles of North American territory to the United States for about $15 million. That works out to roughly 4 cents per acre. The Louisiana Purchase, one of the most consequential land deals in American history, happened partly because sugar collapsed in Haiti. Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States in a transaction that was made possible, at least in part, by a revolution fought by people on sugar plantations who had simply decided they were done. History works in ways that no one plans for. Beet sugar, steam power, and the democratization of sweetness. Napoleon was also dealing with another sugar problem on the European side of things. Britain's Royal Navy had blockaded French ports, cutting off Caribbean sugar imports entirely. France was running low on sweetness, and the French public, it turns out, does not handle that well. Napoleon turned to beets. A German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had discovered decades earlier that European sugar beets contained sucrose, chemically identical to cane sugar. Napoleon poured resources into beet sugar production on a scale that would have seemed absurd to anyone watching from the outside. He ordered tens of thousands of acres planted across France. He offered cash bounties to farmers who converted their fields. He established research institutions dedicated solely to improving beet sugar yields. It worked. By 1813, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar per year. The monopoly that tropical sugarcane had held for thousands of years was broken. You could now grow sugar in a temperate European field, which was the agricultural equivalent of somebody figuring out how to grow coffee in Antarctica. This created a competition that drove prices down and production up for the next century. And then the Industrial Revolution arrived and the whole thing exploded. Steam-powered mills could crush sugarcane faster and more efficiently than any animal or human-powered system. Railroads moved raw cane from fields to factories in hours. Refining technology improved until producers could create sugar so white and so fine it looked almost scientific. White sugar became a symbol of modernity and purity. Brown sugar, the less refined version that had been the default for thousands of years, became associated with poverty and backwardness, which is somewhat ironic given that they are functionally the same product with trace minerals left in. By the mid-1800s, sugar was cheaper than it had ever been in human history. And cheaper sugar meant more sugar, in more things, consumed by more people who had never in their lives been able to afford it before. The marriage that sealed sugar's transformation from luxury to staple was the marriage between sugar and tea. Britain was importing massive quantities of tea from China, but tea on its own is bitter. Adding sugar made it palatable to working-class tastes. By 1850, British factory workers were consuming an average of 2 cups of heavily sweetened tea per day. Sugar imports to Britain doubled between 1840 and 1860 alone. The government lowered tariffs on sugar imports specifically to keep the working class fed and functional enough to keep showing up to their 12-hour factory shifts. Cheap sweetened tea and jam sandwiches became the unofficial fuel of industrial capitalism. Sugar was not just a food at this point. It was an economic instrument. And the people consuming it in the greatest quantities were the people who had benefited from it the least throughout its entire history. By 1900, the average English worker was stirring sugar into their tea 3 times a day. 100 years earlier, that same worker's great-grandparent would have considered sugar a substance they might encounter once or twice in a lifetime, at someone else's celebration from across the room. The cover-up that killed millions. Here is where the story stops being about history and starts being about right now. By the 1950s, sugar consumption in the United States had reached levels that would have been unrecognizable to any previous generation. The Coca-Cola Company had been selling sugar water since 1886, and Americans were drinking it in staggering quantities. Candy bars. Breakfast cereals that had somehow convinced an entire country that dessert was an appropriate morning meal. Processed foods in every direction, all of them sweetened to a degree that matched nothing in nature. And inside the sugar industry, researchers were starting to find things that made the executives very uncomfortable. Internal studies conducted as early as the 1950s showed strong, consistent links between high sugar consumption and heart disease. Not weak correlations. Not preliminary findings that needed more study. Clear signals that sugar was doing serious damage to human health at the quantities Americans were consuming it. The industry did not publish these findings. The industry did not alert public health authorities. The industry did not take out any advertisements saying, "Hey, maybe slow down on the sugar, it appears to be killing people." The industry buried the research and then went on offense. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 scientists at Harvard University, the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money, to publish a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine. The article reviewed existing research on diet and heart disease and concluded that fat, specifically dietary fat, was the primary culprit. Sugar, the review suggested, was not a significant concern. The article was well written, published in one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, and cited widely for decades. It was also, in any meaningful sense, purchased. The documents proving this did not surface publicly until 2016, when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco discovered the original internal correspondence in historical archives. The papers showed exactly what had happened, who was paid, how much, and what the desired conclusion was before the research even began. It was the tobacco industry's playbook, applied directly to food. For 30 years, the American public was told that fat was the enemy. Dietary fat caused heart disease. Fat was what you needed to eliminate from your diet. Low fat became the gold standard of healthy eating, endorsed by doctors, promoted by government guidelines, and plastered across packaging in every grocery store in the country. Food companies responded by removing fat from their products. And then, because food without fat tastes like drywall, they replaced the fat with sugar. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat crackers. Every single one of them loaded with sugar to compensate for the flavor they had engineered out. The result was an explosion of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease that reshaped American public health in ways we are still living with today. And while all of this was happening, a new form of sugar was quietly taking over the American food supply from the inside. In the early 1970s, Japanese scientists developed a process for converting cornstarch into a cheap liquid sweetener called high fructose corn syrup. American corn farmers were already growing far more corn than the country needed, thanks to decades of government agricultural subsidies. High fructose corn syrup gave them a new and enormous market for the surplus. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in their American products. It was cheaper. It was easier to transport. It blended into liquid products more smoothly. Within a decade, high fructose corn syrup had replaced cane sugar in almost every processed food and drink in the United States. Most Americans had no idea the source had completely changed. They were consuming more sugar than at any point in human history, in forms that were harder to identify and easier to hide, in products that were actively marketed to them as healthy choices. The industry knew. The research existed. And for 30 years, the answer was to fund friendlier research and attack anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. Sugar today, hidden, everywhere, and still winning. Today, worldwide sugar production exceeds 180 million tons per year. Brazil is the largest producer, followed by India, the same civilization that invented sugar crystallization roughly 5,500 years ago. The wheel of history has a sense of humor. The average American now consumes about 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 teaspoons for women and 9 for men. We are consuming roughly double to triple the recommended amount every single day, mostly without realizing it. Sugar hides in places most people never think to look. Pasta sauce, bread, salad dressing, granola bars, which have spent decades successfully impersonating health food. An average flavored yogurt contains more sugar per ounce than a candy bar. A single can of regular soda contains about 10 teaspoons of sugar, which is more than an entire day's recommended limit in one drink that takes approximately 4 minutes to consume. Over 42% of American adults are now classified as obese. Over 37 million Americans have diabetes, and another 96 million have prediabetes, which is the universe's way of sending a warning letter before the actual crisis. Heart disease remains the #1 killer in the United States. Sugar is not the only factor in any of these numbers, but decades of research now confirm it is one of the biggest and one of the most consistently underestimated. Some countries have started pushing back with policy. Mexico introduced a soda tax in 2014, and consumption dropped by roughly 12% in the first year. The United Kingdom introduced a sugar levy in 2018, and major drinks manufacturers reformulated their products with less sugar before the tax even took effect, which tells you something interesting about how quickly an industry can move when the financial incentive shifts. Several American cities, including Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle, have enacted local sugar taxes. Early research suggests they reduce consumption. The sugar industry has spent millions lobbying against every single one of them. The industry has not changed its fundamental approach since 1967. Create doubt. Fund research that produces convenient conclusions. Attack critics. Delay regulation. It worked for tobacco for 50 years. It has worked for sugar for longer than that. Sugar's story spans 10,000 years and 6 continents. It started as a wild jungle grass on a Pacific island. Ancient Indian farmers transformed it into a product. Arab chemists refined it into something precious. Crusaders carried it to Europe. Venice sold it at criminal markups. Columbus planted it in the Caribbean. An entire civilization of enslaved people was built around harvesting it. Revolutions were fought over it. A country was accidentally doubled in size because of it. A cover-up protected it. And right now, today, it is sitting in your kitchen. In your bread, your ketchup, your pasta sauce, and your cereal, quietly doing what it has always done. The potato fed empires and caused famines. Tea started wars and built navies. Salt funded Rome and broke the British Empire's moral authority. Sugar did all of those things too, and then it went further. It became the ingredient so embedded in the modern food supply that most people cannot see it even when they are looking directly at it. A 10,000-year-old grass from a jungle in New Guinea built fortunes, destroyed lives, toppled empires, engineered the largest forced migration in human history, and is now the leading dietary cause of preventable disease across the entire planet. Not bad for something you stir into your coffee without a second thought. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of sugar's history stopped you cold. There are more stories like this one coming, and you are going to want to be here for them.